3, 2, 1. All right, this is set 3 of SKT versus STX Seoul, SK Telecom. And it's right now it's tied at 1-1, but we have Fantasy versus Classic. And this is going to be Fantasy in the bottom right corner. That's Fantasy, because they allied him and then switched the colors so that Fantasy is going to be yellow, and then Classic is red because they allied Fantasy. That's Classic. Cool hair, bro, I guess. Dyed it blonde. Classic is, also has a pretty big chin. But Classic is like, it's Terran, 2 Terrans. Fantasy, very good Terran, really well known. Won multiple titles, won an OSL, didn't, right? And but now we're in the Pro League and it's a different game. What builds did these guys prepare for each other, right? They both probably had some idea that they might be playing a Terran versus Terran. That's a logical matchup. And the map is Electric Circuit, so this is a 4-player map. And again, it's a mirror though, so it doesn't totally matter. This map has the feature about this map is that it actually has a mineral only third that is connected to the main. It's like kind of a third. It's not like a full third because it only has minerals, and obviously, if you're a Zerg, you need your third to have a gas, and so it doesn't matter how many hatcheries you put down because you need gas. And so Fantasy, well known. Fantasy's nickname is the Terrorist, and he's well known for drop play and mech play and vulture play because he's not very known for his marine play. Going for the barracks and then the gas. nice ears. What does that say? Myung? Oh, okay, so that's actually Fantasy. Myung is the first part of Fantasy's first name. So, that's okay. So this is Classic. His name is Kim Dong Yu, and Fantasy's name is Jung Myung Hong. Jung Myung Hoon. And so if you hear the Korean guys saying those words, that's their name. Both players look to be scouting in pretty much the wrong direction, or I can't really tell where Classic's scouting. I guess he's gonna try and just scout this main. Oh yeah, because the naturals are clockwise, so he's got to do that little L like that. Is he drawing a question mark? I think it's gonna be a question mark. Yeah, definitely a question mark. Okay. Okay, but yeah, Fantasy is very good at TVT. He has TVT'd with Flash multiple times and won, which is the most impressive thing you can say right now. Whereas Classic has not done anything too impressive. I've seen him. He's been around for a year or two now, but he doesn't have the best win rate. Doesn't have the best. He's never gotten far in an OSL or MSL to my knowledge. So he's not the best player. That's my final stance on him. We'll see, but we'll see if he can take down Fantasy. We'll see if he has anything special prepared. Fantasy, going for a 1-fact CC, and so it's Classic. So even builds from both players. Command Center started at practically the same time. But Fantasy managing to use his barracks, scouting his barracks in the right way immediately. Okay, that Marine... What? Okay. That Marine was standing in a weird position, and then Fantasy just walked right by it, but then I guess he turned around anyways, and now the Vulture's out, so SCV gets taken out. Both players with, like, the exact same army composition. I guess that Vulture has less health, so advantage to Classic? I would say so, right? Well, no, but he's the barracks. Anyways, and the Classic going for a starport, whereas Fantasy's going for a second factory. Now, this means that Classic is probably going to try and get a Wraith to start, but maybe get more dropships earlier on. And Fantasy's going to have to react to this by building, Goliath or turrets, because otherwise he's never, or an academy to, and maybe an academy as well to detect cloaked wraiths if Classic goes that route. Classic doing a nice little wall off. I doubt that's a secure wall, but it might actually work against both vultures and tanks, which is all he needs to worry about. Fantasy going for that. Fantasy getting his third factory. And neither player's gotten gas, their second gas yet. Nice micro. deciding it was worth it to take the damage to get that Marine. But Fantasy's using his barracks to scout around in Classic space. He probably sees that starport and that knows, and he actually has to turn around because that starport's going to be able to take out that one Wraith, could take out his barracks, and that would mean that Fantasy couldn't build any more factories if he lost his barracks. So, but Fantasy is doing the right thing in building an armory, which will allow him to build Goliaths. Choosing not to take out the barracks, which actually is fine because Fantasy already went up to 3 factories pretty fast, so he's probably not planning on adding on any more for a while. Fantasy's trying to poke out with his first few vultures, but doesn't look like they have any upgrades. Oh man, if he takes out this SCV, well, no, nice reaction repairing that SCV. So just kind of draining Fantasy's minerals by ever so slightly. It looks like Fantasy has the Oh wow, wait, never mind. Managing to take out one of those wraiths. I guess one SCV doesn't repair faster than one wraith, especially if it's awkwardly glitching through supply depots and stuff. Um, so that wraith getting 2 kills, doing its job, and he's also managing to scout Fantasy, and now he knows what's up. Whereas, so Classic has a lot of knowledge about what Fantasy's doing because he's forcing him to make Goliaths to counter these wraiths because I don't think Fantasy's not building his own starport or anything. And doing it, yeah, getting a few more SCVs. That's 3 or 4. That's probably 3 SCVs, and delaying the gas a little bit, which will hurt Fantasy's tank count. But just for a second, wow, yeah, delaying it even more. And one Goliath. Are also known for. It's cool when you can get them to move and shoot really well, but they also have pretty bad AI, pathing AI. They're in my opinion, to me at least, they're like almost the equivalent of a Dragoon because they can shoot up and down and walk around and cost 100 some minerals and a little bit of gas too. So yeah, Fantasy's using it. So you got to be careful when you tell them to go places because they get stuck on corners a lot. I've had so many experiences with Goliaths just not doing very well anywhere. Um, but nice having the Goliath stationary by his production facilities, treating it like a turret is pretty good. Classic deciding to add on 3 more factories after his second one, and he has 2 machine shops. So I guess these wraiths are gonna do. What he's counting on is the wraiths to hold Fantasy into his base, and then just building a bunch of tank because by building the wraiths, Fantasy has to build Goliaths, and then those have to stay in his base to protect his base from the wraiths. And that means that Classic has the ability to add on more factories and machine shops earlier. Doesn't need to worry about too many vultures because he knows that Fantasy isn't going to have very many vultures, so he can defend with his wall. And now, look, he has so many tanks, whereas Fantasy probably has many more vultures and Goliaths, which will not win in a straight-up fight. Fantasy deciding he needs to add on his own starport just because if Classic keeps adding wraiths, that's going to obviously become a real problem real fast. Once you get 5 cloaked wraiths, that can take out 1 or 2 Goliaths before you can notice, really. More, probably only 1, but yeah, Fantasy choosing to move his tanks out as well, but doesn't have too many. Whereas Classic has a nice spread there in the middle, covering over that main bridge, even though there is a small entrance down here where Fantasy is. Classic is much more moving into the center, and taking the center is very important in TVT because it's generally the most direct route of transporting your units around. Vulture trying to hide, but then hitting the edge of the map. It's just a game. You can't go outside of a game, right? And the wraiths, doing a lot of damage. But yeah, look at how many vultures Fantasy has. He only has a few tanks and Goliaths, whereas Classic has many more tanks and still a good amount of vultures because he added on those 3 extra gate factories and some wraiths. And yeah, now look, he's easily able to transition into the dropship play, which will be, which is good for him. Trying to harass Fantasy, laying a lot of mines all over the place, but not sure how much is going to help him if Classic just decides to walk around and go through the center. Fantasy's moving a bunch of vultures up here, but they're not going to be able to attack a dropship at all. A big vulture battle, but the tanks supporting those vultures are going to be able to do so much damage. Oh man, but if this race actually catching this dropship, and this dropship's probably going to die, and he can't unload, in space, and dropship dies. Good job. That was nice on Fantasy's part, sensing that dropship was coming, because I don't actually know if he had immediate knowledge. And now it's his turn to move his race around. And Classic has stopped making race. He only has 2 race, and Fantasy now has air superiority. And wow, does Classic even have an armory? Wow, Fantasy managing... Okay, there's the armory. But Fantasy managing to take out a tank, which is more than Classic's done. Taking out a second... Oh man, is he going to take out this tank too? Bang. Yeah. So Fantasy doing a really good job of... By taking out that dropship and now taking out these tanks, that's done so much to bring him back in the build order advantage. Even though, oh man, that tank was so close, but choosing not to finish it off. Fantasy has a lot of vultures and not too many tanks. But right now, I guess it's fine because he's more mobile, and Classic really, I don't know. Classic's deciding to take a third base pretty early. Well, about normal actually. But we'll see if, Fantasy tries to harass it. He's got a dropship, and he's actually sieging up right by that mineral only. This is a pathway into the mineral only that I was talking about. And elevatoring some tanks on the high ground, and that's going to be really effective because now Classic is going to have to somehow try and break that high ground stance that Fantasy has. Because being on the high ground means that there's a 1/3 chance that the low ground opponent's going to miss. But Classic bringing a lot of his tanks back very quickly. And so Fantasy not actually given... Oh, nice. Okay, clears that up. Because Fantasy didn't actually have too much time to take all of his tanks up onto the second story. And building a Valkyrie, that seems a little bit weird because Fantasy doesn't have that many... Doesn't even have that many raids, does he? Both have 5 factories. Oh, and Fantasy's decided to take his mineral only instead of at the third where Classic took his, because this is a gas expansion. And that's set up for Classic now. So Classic has the gas advantage and that extra machine shop, which means that he's gonna have more tanks still. Should have more tanks still. But Fantasy choosing to still has a lot of vultures. He's been laying mines all over the place, but I don't really know. And he's got that dropship too. This is, oh man, is that tank a little bit too close? Yeah, that tank, oh man, but he manages to take another tank. Okay, so establishing the wall. Now both players have clearly divided their side of the map with, Fantasy's takes on the right and Classic's tanks on the left. Fantasy doing this is a nice little touch, taking this 6 o'clock expansion because that's the middle expansion, which means that neither player necessarily has an advantage in holding it because you have the advantage in holding closer bases, right? Classic managing to make a nice concave around in the middle, taking a lot of the middle, but it doesn't look like he's going to be doing too much because Fantasy is just moving around the top with his vultures. And, oh man, this is actually going to be kind of risky for Classic because this third was too far away, and now these vultures are all running in, and oh my gosh, yeah, all these SCVs could just go down right now. He's not even laying any mines to anything, and wow, yeah, all those SCVs die. Oh man, Classic just lost so many SCVs, and now Fantasy's just gonna run away, doing a little bit more microing, taking out some more vultures, but running away, not taking too many losses at all. And that was, wow, so I guess it didn't pay off for Classic there, whereas Fantasy, on the other hand, took his mineral only, which is a lot safer and connected to his main, literally. Which means that vultures, it's a lot harder to get a vulture run by. So Fantasy doing a good job terrorizing Classic. Yeah, it's a little... Wow, it feels a little risky to be walking on all these mines, but I guess that's... they're used to it, playing with fire. Laying mines right next to your tanks, gives you the risk of being mined. There's still mine drags can still happen. That's a real threat. Oh, wow, but nice job, Classic, putting his tanks both on the top and on the left, so it's going to be much harder for Fantasy. Fantasy only has that one small area to do. But on the other hand, wow, I guess it didn't really pay off, did it? Because Fantasy's managing to clump his tanks a lot more, which means that his firepower is a lot stronger in that area. Ooh. Fantasy... Oh, okay. So, Classic scouting that expansion, but Fantasy did a really smart move, taking the 6. That's not really something that you would expect from him. Or that's not something that Classic might expect because it's not a logical third, because it's more risky, but he did it, and it went unnoticed, so I guess that's kind of a hidden base. trying to, and now Fantasy's also trying to take the top part of this again, and yeah, wow, doing a lot of damage. Oh man, and another mine going off. So Fantasy's got done some pretty good chipping away at the concave that Classic was trying to set up, because Classic has most of his tanks down there, and some of his tanks at the top, but when they were spread out in that line, it was easier to dismantle. Fantasy on 7 factories, but still only 2 with machine shops, which means that he can only build 2 tanks at a time. All awkward vultures getting stuck. He probably use those right now, but no, he noticed, so it should be fine. Ooh, wow, more stuck stuff. Yeah, and Classic scouting around, trying to find out where his where Fantasy's expanded to, because it doesn't make any sense for Fantasy to stay on 2 gas this long. He needs to do more. And Fantasy moving in with a lot of vultures, a bunch of vultures going down, but these tanks are sieging up, and now we'll see if he can break this line, laying some mines, and oh my gosh, oh. Ooh, yeah, wow, okay. That didn't work out for Classic too well, did it? He's lost a lot of tanks, and he lost a lot of those frontline tanks, whereas Fantasy managed to bring up his position. So, okay, another moment of calm, though. I guess that's how it happens in TVT. Tank lines set up, and nothing happens. And then as soon as the tank lines move, everything happens all at once. Classic trying to set up some more turrets and stuff, I guess, at his tank line. But Fantasies hasn't really made too many wraiths or dropships like I was predicting they might. Fantasy actually double expanding at the 9 and at the 3 and at the like 130, whereas Classic has reestablished his 9 o'clock and getting the 1030 base. But Fantasy is gonna his advantage is like I think Fantasy has a pretty good advantage right now, because this base has just been mining for so long, and I don't think Classic necessarily even knows. Probably scanned it at some point actually, but yeah. Oh man, and then Fantasy, knows that he's gonna expand, and so he's using more of his vultures to go and harass. He doesn't actually see that expansion, which is too bad, because if he sniped that SCV, it'd be really important, but he doesn't see it. He's trying to escape instead of just going for that SCV, which is too bad, because that SCV is the one thing he needs. Classic also thinking about taking the 12 o'clock, but that was smart, because if you remember at the beginning, yeah, okay, that vulture dies. Oh, okay, yeah, it dies. If you remember at the beginning, though, I want to point out that Fantasy took this part. He didn't try and bust through the center like Classic did when he moved over here, but he moved along down here, and that really allowed him to create this main expansion protect that expansion, because the tank line was already there. And wow, a nice drop. Oh no, nice drop at the mineral only, but there's Wraiths and Valkyries taking out the dropships, but oh my gosh, and those cloaked Wraiths of Classic are, oh my gosh, when did he build those Valkyries? All those Valkyries from Fantasy taking out a lot of Classic's air units, but those Wraiths in the center are actually doing so much damage because they're cloaked, and they've taken out 5 or 6 tanks at this point, which is really bad. And no scans from Fantasy means that all of his Valkyries that he's invested in are going to die as well. I think it maybe would have been better if he had just built a bunch of Wraiths. Okay, finally a scan goes down, notices that there's a bunch of things, but both those Valkyries go down. All of his Valkyrie and dropships went down right there, so he lost a lot of his air army, whereas Classic's air army is still consisting of some Wraiths, cloaked Wraiths that are in the center. But wow, actually that drop did a lot of damage. And he's taken out that mineral only and a lot of SCVs, but it looks like this position might finally be cleaned up. Yep, oh man, and losing another Valkyrie. I don't know why he rallied that Valkyrie if he knew there was tanks. But oh my gosh, a lot of vultures from Fantasy being very aggressive in the middle and pushing all these tanks back with a lot of heavy mine placements. Wait, okay, maybe all of those mines were Classics, and so it's fine. But Classic now set up his expansions and trying to push forward here. Fantasy doesn't have too many tanks set up in the middle either. The top half of the middle, wow, it's a lot of tanks from Classic right there. So we'll see if this is his moment to press in on Fantasy. Fantasy, lost all those units at the drop, and even though he traded, it was worth it in one sense because he took out all those SCVs in that command center, but it wasn't worth it in a different. But he obviously traded because he lost those forces, and now he has less forces in the center. He lost immediate army for the promise that Classic was going to lose army later because he killed his economy. And Fantasy doing that thing you can do in Terran vs. Terran, where once like the middle's kind of at it's close to a stalemate. I'm not gonna say it's total stalemate, because I'd say the Classic has a lot more units in the middle, which means he's at the advantage. But yeah, Fantasy just decided to take every single base on the right side of the map. So, this is where he feels comfortable enough to defend all of that at once, because once the middle's locked down, it's really hard to get any solid, like, significant troop movement, aside from drops and vultures, maybe. And wow, okay, so Classic lost some of his tanks, but as you notice, Fantasy was pushed back against the edge of that center. But that's where it really points. That's the line that Fantasy needs to defend, that those tanks were on the bottom, because once Classic can break through those tanks, then Fantasy's natural is exposed. Like that bridge right there is really a line that's worth noting. Fantasy, neither player have too many vultures anymore, but a lot of wraiths from Classic trying to scout around. They could actually do significant damage because it doesn't seem like Fantasy has any air detection, either cloak detection or anti-air at either of these bases, I would assume. So he's running his SCVs away, but that's just going to lead the race over to the 130. I don't know if that's the best idea. Fantasy's moving around, trying to... really, at this point, I'd say he's trying to save his bases. Classic has a nice, is still really like on top, literally to the north of Fantasy. So it's gonna be hard to break through this, but he's going for it anyways. I guess those were his mines, so we didn't have to worry about them. Laying one mine is not enough, and moving his tanks very, very close and sieging up, and boom, oh my gosh, taking out all of these tanks from Classic. Yeah, Classic just didn't have enough to really hold on to all the forces that Fantasy's done, and that's actually forcing him to lift at 12 o'clock, because that's no longer safe expansion. Man, so Fantasy doing a good job of reclaiming the middle, but again, he's at an advantage if he claims the middle, because he took this 6 o'clock when it mattered, which was a long time ago. One SCV just chilling, not about to leave anytime soon. That would probably die. Oh man, but so I'd say Fantasy's at a pretty big advantage right now. Just he has more bases, and he's managing to chip at Classic where it matters. Classic's doing a good job of like holding Fantasy back, but every time Fantasy breaks away, he's just able to do more damage to Classic. So Classic's positioning might be better, but he doesn't actually have the army value that he needs. And I guess that came from, and that's logical, right? Because Fantasy did a good job harassing. He took out a lot of SCVs earlier on in the game, and that's probably why he has so many more units. Look at that. And he's got all those Goliaths too. So the thing is that even if they have an equal number of tanks, those Goliaths are what's going to be able to move forward and actually shift the tank lines and allow Fantasy to push forward. Classic has a race, which should be able to let him do the same thing, but it's just not the same, because he has so many more Goliaths and a lot of tanks sieging up, but a lot of tanks. Oh no, no, no. Oh my gosh, look at all those tanks doing so much damage to Fantasy's line. Fantasy has too many tanks on the bottom, and the top ones are dying, whereas whoa, and just all of a sudden there's nothing in between them anymore. The tanks just taking everything out. There's so many T's in TVT. I'm sorry. It's really bothering me. Yeah, that turret, good turret placement. That turret is protecting so many of the tanks, and all of those tanks are protected by that turret, because Classic can't lose 3 or 4 wraiths. Oh, whoa, but Fantasy transitioning. Once you get 6 bases, you can transition into whatever you want. Transitioning into 6 or 7 starports right there. 7 starports. You're probably just going to build a bunch of wraiths, and the difference is, once you have 5 wraiths, 1 turret means that if you're trying to take out a tank, 1 turret will take out 2 of your wraiths, and then you have almost half your wraiths that you started with. But if you have like 10 or 20 wraiths and you want to take out a tank, oh man, Fantasy pushing more in the center, and oh man, yeah, this isn't looking too good for Classic. He's losing all these tanks, losing so much position. Wow, and yeah, that tank died probably from mines. Fantasy continuing to press forward. He's pushed Classic's tanks to the north, and now he can just walk down along this bridge, which is what I was talking about. This bridge is like the line where once Fantasy crosses it, he's like really right up against Classic's natural, and that's really bad for Classic. Wow, it might not even get to the late game Wraith stage where both players just tech switching it up. Classic might not even get the chance. All these wraiths, once you have 10 wraiths and you're trying to take out a tank, if they're protected by one turret, you can just take out the turret fast enough that even if you lose 1 or 2 wraiths, you've only lost some of your wraith count, not half of it, and then you can just harass the tanks as much as you want. A lot of dropships from Classic, but I'm not necessarily sure if this is a good idea because all these wraiths are just going to be able to... Dropships don't shoot, and if he loads all of his units into these dropships, Fantasy's cloaking the wraiths, and he's about to walk in. Is he going to see these dropships? Oh my gosh, he's loading everything up, and boom! Wow, dropship's getting one-shotted. He's unloading all the things, but it's not enough. He takes out all... Oh my god, look at all the dropships being taken out. Wow, one dropship, and yeah, so... Oh, whoa. That's no good for Classic. Classic just lost so many resources. All of his investment in those starports just nothing because Fantasy built 7, and that's a lot. That was too bad because even though he lost 1 or 2 wraiths, he still has 6 or 5 or whatever. And now with more reinforcements, taking out the turret, and all these tanks are just, they can't do anything. They can just unsiege, but it takes so long, so slow. And meanwhile, Fantasy's not even waiting. He's just going to, as soon as those tanks unsiege, he moves his own tanks in, and he has so many more tanks. And this is all the way to the north side. This is where a lot of Classic's mining bases are. Those 2 bases are really a lot of Classic's biggest bases, whereas Fantasy has 3 or 4 up on this right side. Fantasy sending the vultures and more harassment and leaving his tanks out front is going to make sure that Classic's tanks can't just walk up and Classic forced to turn around. Sorry, I just texted actually. Classic trying to break through the center here, but I don't know if it's going to be enough. Fantasy some SCVs caught off guard and dying, but SCVs kind of suck, honestly. Whatever. Oh god, but yeah, Classic just letting his bases get ravaged by just a few vultures. Wow, not many. He has 1 mining base, I think, and meanwhile Fantasy has so many wraiths. These are all gonna do so much damage to all these wraiths. These wraiths just taking out all. GG. Whoa. Whoa, okay, GG. Sorry, Fantasy, good job there. Really solid army positioning means that his tanks were always more effective than Classic's, and Classic wasn't ever able to do any kind of harassment really or do anything to Fantasy's economy, and so Fantasy just did the steamroll thing where you're a Terran and you just crush the other person. Alright, that's GG. Bye.